Good evening and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. My name is Nate and I'm joined by my co-host JM and Ann. In the last episode, we discussed the works of Mary Shelley, who is almost universally considered to be a major pivoting point in the genre of science fiction. And in a few episodes' time, we'll be discussing some of the works of Jules Verne, who is another major pivoting point in the history of science fiction. But in between the publication of Frankenstein and Jules Verne's, there's about a period of 50 years. So in this episode and the next episode, we're going to be discussing a bit of what comes in between. So the two works we're going to be looking at tonight are two novels. The first being The Mummy, a tale of the 22nd century. And the
You gotta
second
make
being
sure you get that exclamation point
The
on.
Mummy, yes. It's the most exciting punctuation mark for
It
the
is.
most exciting tale. And Star Psi of Cassiopea. So the first work we're going to be discussing is The Mummy. It was written by Jane Webb, initially published anonymously. The second edition actually bore her name. Jane Webb was born into a wealthy family. However, her mother died in 1819 when Jane was quite young. Around this time, she extensively traveled Europe and learned several languages and was very well read in the classics. And in the very beginning part of The Mummy, she references Aristophanes, Plautus, Terence, as well as Shakespeare and Moliere. Jane was 18 or 19 during the first publication. I'm not exactly sure what the actual publication date was. Her father died penniless when she was 17 in 1824, and she took up writing as a means to support herself. She publishes a book of poetry, The Mummy, and a second novel, The Stories of a Bride. She met her husband, who was John Loudon. He had reviewed The Mummy previously and loved the work. At the time, Jane was 23 and John was 47. Even in the 19th century, that's a bit of an age difference. However, the two seemed really fond of one another. Jane continued to write for the rest of her life, primarily in horticultural and gardening works. And her gardening books contain really gorgeous illustrations that she drew herself. There is a popular biography of her published in the 1960s called The Lady with Green Fingers, which I wasn't able to track down. It's not on the internet, and if we weren't in a pandemic, I would probably be able to get it from interlibrary loan. But we're working with these troubling times here. But the Loudons were friends with Charles Dickens and Thackeray in their personal lives, so they were quite connected with the literary circle of the day. So with that brief biography of Jane Webb, let's start to unbandage this corpse.
Yes, and a portentous corpse he is, our Cheops. So this book is, it's there's a lot of things about it that are funny and that are kind of, I guess, improbable, maybe you could say. But I really enjoyed it. I had a good time with it, and I don't know what you guys thought. We were talking about it a little bit earlier, but it's a very it's a very gothic tale. It's funny. She does have a sense of humor, and compared to the other books that we've done so far, this one has a lot more dialogue. So it's certainly very different in that sense. Of just reading it, you could really hear the voices in your head, and I like to picture, certain actors maybe doing some of the parts. It's definitely inspired by Egyptology that was very significant at the time in England. They actually had public unbandagings of mummies that were but people just basically the history of Egypt was just sort of raided for European enjoyment.
And thanks to Napoleon.
Yeah, thanks to Napoleon, but the British seemed more than happy to
absolutely
participate as well. And there is probably both Mary Shelley and Jane Webb may have witnessed some of these spectacles, I would imagine.
I forget the date it was, but I was reading that there was an importation of one of the mummies to either the British Museum or something like that around the time that this was written. And it was a big public attraction that brought in a lot of curious eyes. This novel came out roughly 10 years after the initial publication of Frankenstein, and certainly after the play Presumption. So Webb would have definitely been familiar with the Frankenstein story. And I think you can see a lot of that influence in the scenes involving the mummy itself, particularly the resurrection of the mummy.
Right.
Well, didn't she actually disagree with the politics that were in Frankenstein? because I had read somewhere that she was like clearly like horrified by science being bigger than God, I guess, and this is like her. This was like her way to like kind of talk about that. It was like a, what do you call it? It was just
A
like
rebuttal.
a rebuttal. Yeah, it was a rebuttal to the Frankenstein that she was like, oh, gosh. And that's why in the end of the book, they kind of go, well, it could have been science, or it could have just been a coincidence, and maybe they just got resurrected by spiritual forces, you know? So,
Yeah, they're both very different kind of creatures too. The Frankenstein's monster is this tortured soul outcast from humanity who just wants revenge against his creator and everybody who's harmed him. Where Cheops the mummy, I don't know what his motivation is half the time. He's just hanging out, giving people advice. It's like what?
So there's two literary characters that Cheops the mummy, who is revived by electricity, very blatantly stated
Right.
that it's
Yeah.
electricity.
And that's one of the best scenes in the book because
It is. It's amazing.
Edric is talking to the doctor character, Edric being one of the main characters in the novel. And he's just talking about so nonchalantly, I was thinking about resurrecting a corpse today.
yeah.
And the doctor's like, yeah, I think we got a battery in the garage that ought to do the trick. And then they go on and resurrect the mummy. And it's like,
Yeah.
all right.
So there's two literary characters that this Cheops reminds me of. Well, maybe before I go into that, I'll just try and briefly summarize this rather long book. So there's these two families. One is the family of the Duke of Cornwall, and the other is the family of the Sir Ambrose. And we start off with a chapter describing how the politics and society is in the 22nd century. And so this is basically a gothic melodrama that, just for kicks, Jane Webb decides that she wants to set in the future. And believe me, she sure has a lot of fun with it. So these two families have the queen is, the whole royal structure has changed kind of dramatically. There's been a whole bunch of revolutions in England and stuff. And the queen is now elected, sort of. She's elected by representatives of the various counties, and of course, all those representatives are men. It's pretty explicitly stated. So, what looks at first like a statement for feminism is not really. But Jane is smart enough to be rather cynical about this because she kind of shows that really what people are interested in is having a ruler that they can control, or certain people. And so, the queen has this champion. The current queen has this champion named Edmund. He's kind of he's been responsible for crushing a lot of her enemies and crushing the enemies in Germany. And he is I have to keep all the family shit straight. That's actually kind of difficult sometimes. So
Yeah,
Edmund
especially because they
is the
pull like a
son of-
secret identity twist at the end.
Yeah,
So-
and that really throws everything into chaos. This is a complete gothic melodrama, basically, and it's got international intrigue and sort of sibling, but not really sibling rivalry. It's got crazy Doctor Strangelove like scientist named Dr. Antwerpen, who's basically been tutoring the son of the Duke of the son of Sir Ambrose. And the son of Sir Ambrose, his father has this idea that he's going to marry into the royal family, but he's like, no, I just want to resurrect dead flesh. And so he goes off to Egypt in a really funnily described balloon trip, and this is actually one of the most hilarious parts of the books because they're coming down over Egypt, and she's describing how it's become basically this huge industrial society. But it's very colonial, so don't get your hopes up for any Egyptian representation, because there really isn't any. So as they're coming down, and she describes to how ridiculous Dr. Antwerpen looks. And she's always doing this. And they're coming down over Egypt, and they're coming down over this city, and everybody's staring at them. And Dr. Antwerpen's like, oh, look at these backwards people, and they've never seen anything like this before. Our advanced, my super awesome balloon, and he doesn't realize that they're just pointing and laughing at him because he just looks so stupid. And so they go down over Egypt, and they just kind of walk right into the tomb of Cheops, into the pyramid, and basically apply a battery to him. And oh yeah, the whole reason why he wants to do it on a mummy is that he thinks it would be more clean and less disgusting than going to a graveyard.
Yeah, the philosophical dialogue they have at the beginning about the mummy is another really funny scene, because they all act so nonchalant, matter of fact, where Frankenstein is like this really conflicted character, and there's just no conflict internally with these people at all.
Well, yeah. So once they actually do it, and there's this basically a giant storm and explosions, and it's like a really crazy scene where everything is, you kind of picture like, I don't know. I've read this book, and because it's so different than everything else we've done so far, it was really easy to picture everything and make it like sort of, you could kind of almost do a direct to the screen of your mind, the translation of this book. So it reminded me of, the Universal movies and beyond interpretation of the Frankenstein monster revivification scene with all the electricity sparking everywhere, and the two guys running back and forth flicking switches, and all this chaos. But this is all done, it's done a bit scarier in the sense that they don't actually really know what's happening. They literally do not seem to know. They're just like, let's try this and see what happens. And everything goes crazy. And to make a long story short, the mummy revives, but they kind of miss it because so one thing you can make fun of this book for is talking about how people faint when bad shit happens, and it's not just the women, it's the men too. So she's actually very equal about it. The men are always like, oh, and passing out, They probably do it more than the women do.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. And so they kind of miss it. And the next thing they know, they're in prison. And they're being charged with violating the tomb. And the mummy is gone. And so is Entwerfen's balloon. There's a lot of stuff that goes on with them being in prison and with the mummy showing up in England. So there's two things that this reminds me of. There's two literary characters that Cheops actually reminds me of. One is Dracula. Both of these would come later, by the way. So one is Dracula with the the story of Redfield,
the foreigner
going
infiltrating England.
Right. The other is, this is kind of funnier to me. The other is the comic/radio character, the Shadow. Probably most people know about the Shadow. He's kind of this invisible psychic cop, but he's not really a cop. He's actually just an interested bystander, but he helps out the police, and he does this by basically tormenting criminals into confessing their evil deeds, and they cannot see him. So he basically just walks around, and it's because it's the most famous iteration of the Shadow is a radio series. So the characters on the show are always talking to themselves, and they're like, no one will ever discover this thing that I've done, and I'll be able to get away and move to another country. And then all of a sudden they hear this evil voice going, you would think you're going to escape your fate? And of course, the original radio Shadow was played by Orson Welles. So, yeah. Basically, the mummy, Cheops, is this being that teleports around. At first I thought he was just kind of lurking in the shadows, but actually she makes it pretty clear at one point, he's actually teleporting wherever the hell he wants. So he just shows up, and he has a habit of showing up when people are thinking about him too. Like, oh no, that mummy, he told me to do this and everything went wrong, and he's such a terrible fiend. And then you hear the evil laughter, and if it was a movie, there would be a big musical sting going, BOOM! The mummy is here. And so there's a big political intrigue situation where these really hilariously depicted lords of the kingdom want to elect this one of the two candidates for the queen.
Lord Doodle and Noodle.
Lord Doodle and Noodle, yeah. And Lord Gustavus, who's always saying shit like, as I believe, and as I know everyone who has a sensible mind must believe, It's his like catchphrase. They're really funny, ridiculous caricatures, basically. Um, they want to elect this certain queen, so they put a lot of effort into doing that. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a whole bunch of secondary characters. There's a lot of intrigue, and it'd probably take forever to actually try to explain what really happens. But in essence, this mummy is playing political games with all the people of Britain and beyond. There's a whole detour in Spain where the doctor and this Edric, who's we haven't even mentioned his name yet, but he's the guy who revived the mummy, where the two of them they got out of prison and they got shipwrecked. So that happened too, and they ended up in Spain where there's a very weird political situation, and the army has basically taken control of Spain, and there's a rebellion, and all this stuff is happening, and they befriend. I think he's the governor of the prison, but he's actually one of the rebels. And then he introduces them to the King of Ireland. The King of Ireland, he has his own thing going on. He's the son of a much more tyrannical, warlike King of Ireland, but this is a nice guy. And he really doesn't have any evil intentions toward England or anything like that. But he can, once he kind of befriends Edric, they basically decide to mount a campaign to take England back from the evil cadre of basically incompetent people that's being manipulated by the mummy. And the mummy actually doesn't really have any interest in bettering their schemes. The mummy is more of an avenging kind of like. The mummy kind of represents.
I thought that the mummy was more like Curious George. He kind of, quite honestly, like he wasn't a vengeful. Like the way I saw him was like, I go in, I give advice. Well, let me explain. I go in, I give advice. Everyone blames me for what happened, but then it turns out okay in the end because I fixed it. Like I just found he was a Curious George character more than he was anything else.
He seems to be more curious about human nature and this weird society that he's woken up after 4,000 years. His motivations for why he's doing any of this really aren't clear at all.
They're not.
He seems to be just giving advice to both sides of this political drama.
I don't think he meant anything. Like I didn't put that intonation on there when I was reading it. I just felt it was more like matter of course.
To me, he was all those things, but he represented almost a conscience of the characters. He was the thing looking over their shoulder and taunting them. He was an external force, but he was actually, I think, representing their internal doubts and insecurities, and that's why every time they talked to him, they always felt bad. And he always felt bad in turn because he was making everyone feel like shit. But she even describes it like it's a burning in your soul when you talk to this mummy.
Well, that means he's just right. That's all.
Yeah.
But he's right. And he probably knows better than the rest of them because they're all running around, like stupid.
Right. I mean, the motivations of all the other characters are very hard to ascribe to. A lot of the characters do things and say things that just kind of don't make any sense.
I was going to say they're very flat in a way.
Yeah.
Like the motivations, the complexities, they're just not there. And that's why when I read it, I felt like, like a movie in the 30s where it's got really quick back and forth dialogue.
Right.
But it really doesn't have any meat and potatoes to it. It's just broth.
Yeah. You could tell that she was a young and experienced writer when she wrote this because not a lot of the plot is kind of all over the place. The characters aren't really well fleshed out, and some of the prose is ridiculous, but there are really a lot of things to enjoy, and it's really ahead of its time in a lot of ways because we've done a lot of research and things like that spanning the 19th century on potential titles to cover the future, and I think this, out of all the ones that we're probably going to look at, is the most in-depth of crazy future technology. The book is set up like The Last Man, in that it's a 3-volume work of roughly the same length, where book one or volume one more or less establishes the characters and the setting, and the real quote unquote real plot doesn't begin until volume two with the death of the queen and then the rivalry between Elvira and Rosabella for the throne. But all the future tech in volume one is not only wide as far as the nature of the technologies, but it's incredibly elaborate and creative, if not totally
Definitely.
implausible and kind of silly sounding from a 21st century perspective on the matter. But it's a lot more creative and speculative than a lot of other contemporary science fiction works that really just kind of focus on one angle. This really covers the gamut of how an entire society would be transformed by what she perceived to be future technologies.
Yeah,
I think
and
that's
everything
what
is
was nice about it was because unlike what we had with Mary Shelley's works, which were set in the future, but they didn't have any futuristic
exactly.
flavor, this one at least was like attempting to kind of dream up what it could be, and that really made it more science-y to the fiction. And I think I liked that. The one thing I did want to say is to people who don't know, this isn't like The Mummy that the movies were based on. I think that's more the Arthur Conan Doyle one.
Yeah.
And I kind of went in not realizing that, and I went, "Oh, The Mummy, okay." And then I read it, and I was like, "This isn't The Mummy." So, just if anyone was curious, this is not the mummy that you're thinking of.
Yeah, I wasn't really
No.
sure what to expect when I was going in this, because I was reading reviews and summaries, beforehand, and I kind of expected it was going to be like another Traveler's type story. Like, the mummy wakes up, he walks around, and we get an account of what he sees. But the mummy's really in the background the entire time. The
Yeah.
majority of the plot is this, like, Sir Walter Scott type medieval romance, but set in the future of all this political intrigue and stuff. It really reads more like an Ivanhoe type novel than it does any science fiction. And Walter Scott's Waverley novels are explicitly mentioned towards the beginning, so Webb was definitely familiar with them.
I haven't read any of those, but my feeling, I kind of didn't think it was going to be a traveler story, but I thought it was going to be worse than it was. I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did. What you were saying about the amateurishness, Nate, of the writing is, I think it's true, but I really think we should give her a bit more credit because...
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying the entire thing is amateurish. I mean, it does kind of feel like that in places, but there are some really outstanding scenes, especially when they're inside the pyramid and resurrecting the mummy itself. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah.
And
but I also think that she's a little smarter. She's just inexperienced. I think that like a lot of things that, like what you said, don't seem to make sense. If you read on a bit, they eventually kind of do. Like it's
I
not
just
very
wanted
clear
it to
at
be
first.
over. Like honestly, I was like, that was where she was missing the point. Let's be a little bit more concise,
Yeah.
Like
I know,
kind
maybe.
of condense it, girl. We don't need to know about what she's wearing for 2 pages. I mean, there was more descriptions of outfits than I cared to remember. Like that was like,
But the descriptions of the fashion were pretty crazy too. That was something that it was an attempt to differentiate
the
period.
women wore pants sometimes. Wow.
Well, it was a bit more than that. There was the weird headdresses and the
the controllable gas flames that would come out.
Gas hair.
Yeah.
And wasn't there like LED lights too? Like that had like LED different colors of lights and stuff that you could put on.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting, the applications of technology that seem to be inconsistent. So they had the ability to control lighting and gas, but they're using this visual optical semaphore network that doesn't work in the dark because you can't see the flags from 150 feet away. She didn't kind of think to apply it equally, which is, again, not her fault, but it's just interesting looking back 200 years.
It is. And again, like, it's, I mean, obviously her life took a very different course, but I think that her inexperience meant that the things that made sense to her were not always clear to her audience. And I do think a lot of things that she does, like, for example, just to give one example of something that doesn't seem to make sense, but that kind of became clear to me by the end. So when these two women are kind of vying to be queens, they both get up. This is kind of a fun scene. In my opinion, it was a fun scene. So they both get up there and they're supposed to kind of make a speech for the crowd, and it's all this onlooking crowd of admiring men, basically. She does it very sexlessly, but it's kind of hard not to think, okay, this is a little weird. Like these women are basically parading themselves in front of this horde of men. And
yeah, we call that the Miss America pageant.
Yeah.
basically,
Like it happens now.
yeah. So the one girl, Rosabella, she's the hot-headed, impetuous one. She gets up there and she's like, "Yeah, okay, I'll be your queen, but you gotta let me do what I want. I'll be your queen, but you're not gonna push me around." And they don't like that. The second girl gets up there and she's so overwhelmed and she's so shy and she's so overcome that she faints. And they love her. They think she's so great. So all this stuff is going down, and one guy really wants this Rosabella, this Father Morris guy. He's basically an evil, conniving priest. A lot of Gothic novels got to have one of those.
And of course, he's
I liked
Irish.
him. I liked
so
him. I thought he was fun.
Yeah.
So he's this evil, conniving priest. He really wants Rosabella to be queen. And at first that didn't make any sense to me. At first I'm like, well, she's the one that you're going to have a really hard time controlling. She's the one that's going to be like a thorn in your side. Why don't you just say, oh, well, Elvira is obviously much more pliable and easily manipulated. Like, it didn't make sense to me given the character. But then when you read on and you see the twist at the end, and you're like, he was her father the entire time. Oh, sorry, guys, spoiler for a 200-year-old book. But that's it's something that does in fact make sense when you get down to it. But it's easy to get impatient with her because she's an 18-year-old who has a lot to say.
I have
think
one
that's
word,
really all it is.
Sylvia Plath. She never made me say you're 16 or 14. The bell jar, I'm sorry, never had this problem. I don't think the age is really the excuse. I think it's maybe just she wrote a book.
Well, I'm not saying it's an excuse.
But I mean, like her age, but some people who are younger do write really fantastic novels and do write things that are concise and eloquent and filled with wisdom. This was just a little more fluffy. That's all.
And Mary Shelley was about the same age when she wrote Frankenstein.
Right. And Frankenstein was heavy.
Well, Mary Shelley's but everyone's different, right? And
yeah, exactly.
She probably, Mary Shelley probably got started writing a lot earlier. And who knows, what things, how much, I don't think that Jane Webb was exposed to the literary scene.
No, she was definitely not part of the
teenager.
same literary circle. I mean, Mary Shelley was hanging out with Byron and Percy Shelley, whereas Jane Webb was clearly very well educated, clearly very intelligent, and clearly very well read. I don't think she started writing for any motivation other than financial.
Right, and in time, if she had kept doing that instead of getting more into other things like gardening and raising domestic pets.
Well, she did that because she was a proper Victorian, and her husband was into botany, wasn't he?
He was a major botanist.
Yeah, so her husband was a botanist, and so she did the only thing that she could, which was to draw pictures of his plants and write gardening books.
Right.
That's what liberated women do.
Pretty much the only books she wrote after the marriage that were fiction were morality tales for children. So it still relates to women's domesticity in a way.
Yeah. And it's interesting that I read somewhere that it was actually Mr. Loudon there. He contacted her, and the thing that actually was brought to his attention was the future she described and the machines and stuff. And he thought that was really interesting, and that was a talking point between them when they first started corresponding. So it's interesting that he maybe wasn't that interested in fostering her literary ambitions. I really don't know. But it is a shame. It is a shame that she didn't write anything else, because I think she would have overcome those things. And I'm not saying that they're a factor of her age. They're a factor of her inexperience, for sure, though. And Mary Shelley had a different sort of life, I think, early on. So
she was very exposed. I mean, she already lost her first kid by the time she was like 17.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and both of her parents were authors. They had both written several novels by the time she was born.
Yeah. And Jane lost her dad. But
yeah,
she
but
was
Mary Shelley had a lot more depth to her character and to her
oh yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
and the richness of her life and who she was and how forward-thinking she was really did come through in her text. And as we see, the poor Miss Webb is very much a little girl, and that's how she's very domesticated.
Yeah.
Whereas Mary Shelley was never domesticated, you know?
Yeah, and at times it really does read like fan fiction. Like a lot of the dialogue is clunky, the actions are awkward. Maybe something makes sense at the end with a final twist, but a lot of the times you just really had no clear motivations for anything that the characters are doing. Though I
Yeah,
think it is enjoyable given all that.
Yeah.
It does have its own certain charm. It's a fun read despite the fact that it is a little on the long side. It's roughly 175,000 words, which translates into, I don't know, 450, 475-ish standard
yeah.
pages.
The whole thing in Spain is probably the least good part.
Actually,
it's
one of my favorite parts in the book, beside the pyramid scheme, pyramid scene, is one of the descriptions of the Spanish Civil War, where a city's just been totally destroyed, and there's like this gore and carnage everywhere. And I was kind of surprised at how graphic she gets with that one
Yeah.
scene, because it's not really something you see in the rest of the novel, even when they're actually resurrecting a corpse and the mummy's
Yeah, no,
walking around like scaring people and stuff.
I did appreciate that part, and she did actually kind of talk about war and how horrible she thought it was. And there's a lot of, it was cool, but it was, I don't know. I actually found the drama at home a little bit more interesting, oddly enough, which is kind of weird because I would have thought it would have been the other way around. But I think that she was good at portraying English society in a rather cynical way. And I think there's a lot more cynicism in here than is at first apparent. Some of it is maybe a little bit misguided. For example, she says that there's universal education now, which great thing, right? Awesome. It means that English people can speak so many languages, basically every language. So even though somebody can speak ancient Egyptian, they can understand it perfectly. Universal education sounds great, but it means that it applies to the underclass, the servant class as well. And what happens as a result of that is that everybody in the servant class basically talks like Data from Star Trek.
Yeah, the technobabble
It is
is really
hilarious. It is something else, and the way she basically describes it is this is a trend among the educated lower classes, that they have adopted this very meticulous, overdone way of speech that is like, those episodes of Star Trek TNG when Data is doing something that's emotionally really awkward and weird, like trying to domesticate himself and living with a woman, and you sort of spend the whole episode like cringing a little bit, but kind of enjoying it on a weird level. It's kind of like that. Like, it just doesn't. It's funny and it's cringy at the same time. And yeah, it's basically 1820s technobabble.
And they portray it as an annoyance. Like, these servants are so overeducated that they're just so annoying every time they talk that it's not even worth them being educated.
Yeah, pretty
I
much.
think that's how lots of men felt about women when they started
Yeah.
going to school too.
Yeah, right.
Oh, you're so annoying because you have those 10-cent words you throw
Yeah.
around like you mean them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I think with Jane it's definitely a class thing, because she's very cynical about this queenie election-y shit. She's very cynical about that. She knows full well that what it really is about is these men want to have a ruler that they can easily control. Of course, in the end, that's probably going to happen anyway, and because they're in love, I guess it's okay. But she's basically saying, that this is all kind of a bit nonsensical, and I think that Cheops kind of is there to critique that whole thing a little bit as well, because he's basically the wolf set loose among the sheep. And yeah, he gives advice to everybody. He's playing everybody, and he's kind of like reminding everybody of all their misdeeds, and so they quail whenever he's near. And I actually really enjoyed that. It was over the top, totally over the top, because yeah, every time the mummy appeared, it was like the evil laugh, and then in my head I heard the bum bum bum, and it's just like, oh, here he is. ready to deliver some harsh words, and then kind of pick the people up again. It was like she described them basically being enslaved by him, and
it's kind of odd that there's been so many mummy movies, but none of them drew from Webb. Even just like
Yeah.
cannibalizing out the romantic medieval stuff.
Didn't Arthur Conan Doyle write a mummy book though?
I'm pretty
Story?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think they may have taken more of that one than they did this one.
Right, but I mean, through all the mummy movies through the years, it's just I don't know, kind of odd to me that some scriptwriter didn't say, this is clearly out of copyright and in the public domain. I could rip this off just fine. But it doesn't seem like anybody
it doesn't
has.
seem like no, and it would be like Anne said, it would have been a really good like 1930s 40s
Oh yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
like you could totally picture it. And,
Yeah,
and
with a snappy
in my
dialogue
head,
and-
I thought, don't. I'm sorry, but the mummy is the shadow. I'm sticking to that. It totally fits.
I'd like to see Mae West deliver some techno babble.
Yeah. Or what's her name? What's that film noir?
Barbara Stanwyck.
Yeah.
It did. It definitely
So,
had that Cary Grant thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Cary
right,
Grant
yeah.
and Katharine Hepburn
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah, I don't know. It was fun, but there was other weird stuff in there too. There was a really awesome courtroom scene in the third volume where she described everybody basically but the jury and the clerks are machines. So the judge is a machine, the lawyers, the defense attorney, and the prosecution are automata.
Wind-up
And-
automatons at that.
Yeah, they're wind-up automatons. And the cool thing is, these guys prepare the legal documents, and they feed the legal documents into a slot, and the legal documents get all ground up, and the thing speaks. And you can put the document into various holes designating what language they might be speaking. So there's a funny scene. First, the prosecution speaks, and he makes a really stirring speech, but the clerk didn't wind him up far enough, so he sort of starts to run down like a gramophone and just kind of goes slow and stops. But it was a great speech. Everybody agrees that it's awesome. So the defense attorney, who happens to be one of these lords, is really excited about this masterful speech that he prepared. And he shoves the document in the slot, but oh no, he got the French slot. So the thing starts speaking in French, and he's so horrified at this. He's like, but what if somebody doesn't understand French in this courtroom? And they're like, oh, don't worry, everybody understands French. Okay, cool.
But she really used that opportunity to make fun of the French too, because the French speech breaks out in this like elaborate, ridiculous poetry, which may not be too far off from the truth, given the next novel that we're going to be examining
I
in a
was
couple
just about
minutes.
to say,
Yeah.
that's like a really good lead-in to the next one, because I think we've pretty much talked
Yeah.
this one to
Yeah.
death.
Well, The Mummy, it's fun, it's a little long, but I enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, I don't know. I had a really good time with it,
Yeah.
actually. I gave it a 3-star rating on Goodreads, which is probably about, I'm not going to raise it, but I enjoyed it more than that might imply to some people. All the negative things, or the things that could be signs of her inexperience as a writer, are definitely there. But I worked in the library for the Blind in Toronto for a long time, and we produced a lot of books, a lot of really mainstream kind of romance, fantasy, all this stuff that people like to read nowadays. And I've seen so much worse that's been published in mass market of today. So
I don't know if I
that's
liked
really
it as
all I
much
have to
as
say
you
about
guys. You guys seem to like it more than I did. I was a little bit like, oh, would we please get on with it? Like
I had that feeling too.
most of it, like I really wanted to get to the parts that I wanted, like the good parts,
Yeah.
I think I would have liked it better had there been more of that fun stuff, the dialogue, like some of the fun little scenes, and then just took a lot of the politics and the BS out of it. I think
Yeah.
I would have liked it more.
Yeah, the technobabble in the weird world is really confined to Volume 1, and Volume 2 and 3 you get all the political intrigue and stuff, which is a little bit fatty and could have been cut down. Fairly.
Yeah, I think that's what I would. I mean, I thought it was fun to read, but I don't know if I'd be like, hey, you know what book you need to read?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Whereas,
wouldn't
like,
necessarily say that either.
Yeah.
with
It did
Star,
take me
however,
it did take me a long time to read it. It
I
took
was
me a
going to
long
say,
time to read it. That's
with Star, however, that is a book that I would recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into Star. This was written a little later than The Mummy. This was written in 1854. Not too much is known about the author, Claude Ishir de Fontenay. He was born of peasant stock, and he died young. He was born in 1819 and died in 1856. He'd become a doctor of medicine in Paris in 1845. And in addition to Star, he published his doctoral dissertation on tuberculosis in 1845, 4 plays, as well as a early text on plastic surgery, which he published under a pseudonym of his initials being CID. And he died young, presumably as a practicing doctor, and just doing literature as a side thing. So one thing I thought was interesting about this book is that the translated title is Star Psi of Cassiopea, being in the original French. The word star is the word that's used in the original French text, so it's not the French word for star, it's what we use in English. So kind of an odd translating issue that kind of lends a bit of an oddity to the initial text.
He describes it. He tries to say something about that. I didn't quite understand what he was saying. He's like, it's pronounced like Earth, and I don't really know what he meant. It actually reminded me of a comedy sketch about a guy from Toronto looking for a job in Quebec that I'll share with you guys later. Maybe,
Okay.
but it was like, it's pronounced like this. It's pronounced like Earth. What? And I always see what he meant, but I don't really understand what he meant at the same time. It's kind of weird.
He almost used the words interchangeably, too, because he would say Earth.
Right. Yeah.
And human.
Yeah. So star is the name of the planet. It's not a star. So that does kind of lend some odd issues with the translation and reading it as an English reader.
Yeah.
I really like this book. I love the language. I like the descriptiveness. And this one, I think, so far has felt the most modern.
Oh, absolutely.
In the tone and in the concise, but like really punctuated prose.
Yeah.
Like I found it really fun to read, and it was like visual and enjoyable and really quick to get through too.
Oh yeah, it's very short. It's about 195 pages. And due to the style of the book, a lot of those aren't full pages with text. So I guess to briefly summarize the novel, it's presented as a series of documents found in the Himalayas of an extraterrestrial civilization where the guy basically crash landed on Earth and he had all these texts from his multi-star solar system and their civilization. So the anonymous narrator who finds these texts translates them all into French, and then provides a really concise history of the society for roughly the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book, we're treated to more what's presented as primary sources from the civilization. So we get 2 different plays. We get a historical poem in verse, or a what has he described? A historical poem in prose.
Prose poem.
Yeah. And a first-person travelogue, basically, around a couple of the planets, describing the cities. And interposed with the pseudo-historical narrative are a series of poetry and other short drama pieces. So in a sense, it's very modernistic in that way, where it kind of breaks the genre form and really bounces around different styles.
It was just so fun, and they had like I was gonna say something real quick. I just totally lost it. But I was gonna say Cimmerillion-esque, if that's a word.
Yeah.
Like it had that token type of. It didn't read like a token story, but it had that really complete history with like this complete, like you could really understand who these people were. And he really developed like its own mythos, which is really something that we do end up seeing later in science fiction, like the mythology that becomes from these stories. And I loved that aspect of it.
And it's a very complicated mythos too, because it's not just the entire planet has the same culture and that's it. There's like half a dozen different tribes, different nations that all have different mythological beliefs. They all have different attitudes towards
and some
society.
of them have different biology too.
Yeah, right. So that's one of the major themes that stuck out for me as being really the only thing dating this novel to the mid-19th century, for everything else being very ahead of its time, is you have kind of two species that are on the planet Star. The Starians, who are the educated, civilized, basically white people, and then the Replus, who are, the inferior, third world, black people, essentially.
And he's very blatant about it. He's
yes.
very blatant about it, but this is the position of the person writing this original text.
Absolutely. So this is a product of the 1850s when French colonialism was just getting a huge restart after all the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars and the internal revolutions. France had started to invade Algeria during this time, so there's really a lot of that African, especially colonialism, in this novel. And
the social Darwinism.
Yeah,
is
absolutely,
really heavy.
Absolutely. Like these people are portrayed by the entire work. I mean, there's really no dissenting opinion amongst any of the multicultures.
No, I mean in the prose poem, they're described with a bit more tenderness, but it's not, and even intelligence. But that's really the only thing. And there's a lot of other parts where it's like, oh, those terrible, weak-minded, weak reptiles, and they're so despicable. But that seemed to mostly come from one specific point of view, and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think he did try to differentiate it. And one thing I also thought was interesting was, yes, there's the Starians and the Replus, but there's also these Nemzets, who are these really long-lived, ancient, wizardly people, and they're almost like the civilization. I don't know. It almost makes me think of, these lost race kind of stories where there was the previous civilization that was way more advanced, and there's only a few of them left because some weird catastrophe happened and they became sterile, but they're almost immortal. And they're like, eventually he actually says, well, actually they're not immortal, because now thousands of years have passed since we first met these Nemzed people, and they're actually getting old now. But their job seems to be to teach the Starians things. And they seem to have no real interests besides art and science. That seems to be their only purpose. And so really, the Starians are kind of in the middle, and these Replus are at the bottom, and on the top, there are these Nemzeds who are almost like teacher angels or something like that.
Yeah, but when they were saying stuff about the poor Replus, they were like, they're bred for servitude and they like it.
Yeah.
They love being servants. They're made for it. They wouldn't want it any other way. Like, it was pretty derogatory.
It was pretty derogatory, and then when the people left, the Starians left, he talks about how the Replus basically descended into barbarism, so it's like, without us, they're nothing. They can't do this
they
without
need
us.
the guided hand of intelligent civilization to show them, to beneficially show them, in fact, the way.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of whole attitude presented throughout the novel, is the Starians are this benevolent race of colonizers. They're showing the rest of the solar system, the proper way to live life. And we encounter a couple of planets in the system, and
which are actually satellites of Star itself.
Yeah.
Which actually makes sense, because they do call it Star, even though it's not technically a star as we recognize a star, but in previous ages, when people looked up into the sky, they occasionally did refer to planets as stars.
It's a very interesting astronomical system, and he tries to portray that in the text of what that would look like for a sunset or something like that.
Yeah, there's even a map at the beginning because of the Starian system. That's pretty cool. There can't be too many fictional books that predate Cassiopea that have something like that.
I don't know if the illustrations were from the original printing, though. I think those were done later. I think those were done from the 1970s printing.
Yeah, because if you look
the
at some of the
translation.
prints, if you look at some of the prints in there, you're like, that's totally a 1970s drawing.
Yeah.
Like, that's obviously
Makes
not
sense.
original.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that there's like, that's the stuff that was so great about it, is that it's such a. I love Ancient Aliens. I love the idea that, I'm a Philip K. Dick fanatic. So whenever there's like a story that has, oh, hey, there's this civilization that's really old, then they have been here before us, and then now they're gone. Well, it really did like pick up on that, and that like really fun sci-fi where like we don't know where the beginning is because it could have already happened, and
Yeah.
we just
And
don't
that-
remember. And then like he finds it here, which means there's interstellar travel, and like maybe we're the whatever it's called, ancient byproducts of these Starians. Who knows? So that was like my favorite part about it.
Yeah, it really sets up a lot of tropes that we'd see through more or less all of modern science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
And you were saying the world building is similar to the Similarian.
Silmarillion.
Yes, that's it. The people on the planet Lessor reminded me a lot of Tolkien's elves.
Yeah.
Like that was the first thing I thought of when I was hearing them described. Additionally, with the interstellar and interplanetary travel, the spaceships they're riding around in sound incredibly modern. I mean, they're pressurized. They need to be mindful of their air. There's issues of takeoff and landing. It's just a lot of things we're going to see coming up in works 100 years later that's almost already fully formed in this.
It reminded me a lot of something that I want to talk about in a later episode, maybe, but the works of Olaf Stapleton, where he basically describes in a book the entire history of a civilization, or even a whole host of different civilizations, all encompassing many different biological / social makeups, and he does it really meticulously, and it makes it really interesting. There's no characters, really. I mean, there's a lot of names, but probably the things that come out most characterfully are the plays. What'd you guys think of the plays?
So, yeah, the plays were cool. My critiques of Jane Webb being amateurish also applies to the drama here. But it's
agreed.
They're funny love triangles and stuff.
Yeah.
But I thought they were pretty amusing, especially the first one where like there's this old guy is trying to hit on this woman, and like there's this other younger one, and it's the three of them kind of the two guys are rivals, and at the end she's like, she's saying like the only thing that keeps me from sleeping is being amorous, but when I'm amorous I never sleep. And it's like, this book, it also struck me as being very French.
Yeah, there's definitely some harsh incel vibes in some of the plays, I thought.
Yeah, what I mean by that, like, if you compare the works of the 19th century in France to the works in England, I think that the French, I mean, obviously, like, we could all name plenty of names, like Marquis de Sade and Octave Morbeau and what's his name, Count de Lautréamont, and these guys that were writing really obscene stuff, and whereas the bulk of English literature was not really going that way yet.
Yeah,
and,
especially in the 19th century. 19th century English culture is notoriously prudish, and continental Europe just gets a lot hornier in their works than that.
And the French never really had those kind of. Now, I'm not saying there's any real obscenity in this book, because there isn't, but there's a certain
there's a free sexness about it, for sure.
Yeah.
I think that was actually really innovative, because they did start to utilize like the sexuality, the reproduction, like that kind
he actually
of stuff.
goes into detail about I think they're I can't remember if they're what satellite they live on, but they're hermaphrodites, and he describes how they
reproduce and stuff.
And there's the other ones that are not hermaphrodites, but she says they can only copulate if they're really, really into each other.
Oh no, it was like penguins, actually. It was like penguins, because like the guy has like his force, and he has to find a mate that has the same life force.
Yes.
And that the men who don't find the woman that has the same like
Life force.
internal fire as he
Yeah,
does or whatever.
They're sad
Then-
forever.
They're sad forever. They're despondent.
Yeah.
They become homeless because they don't have a mate. So,
Yeah.
It's
pretty
very
fascinating.
fragrance heavy. Like there's lots of depictions or descriptions of smells, which I thought was interesting too. He's really interested in the biology and the world and like the life.
And he's
of
a
these
doctor.
strange
That makes
places.
sense.
Yeah, exactly. So he really kind of focuses on these small details. Like you don't really see smells coming up a lot in this kind of early science fiction literature, but it's like an kind of obvious thing that if you were on these planets, it'd be like one of the first things that would hit you.
Yeah.
So a good segue from there.
Well, actually, there was something I wanted to finish from before
Okay.
when you interrupted, which was like, well, you do it all the time. So it was like this. Oh, never mind. I forgot. Go ahead.
What?
No, I forgot. I swear to God, forgot.
Okay, it'll come back to you.
No, I'll just forget it.
Oh, okay. Well, a good segue from that. Last Man, the book we did last time, has a plague in it. This one has a plague in it too. So I rate The Last Man plague 4 out of 10. This plague is a 9 out of 10. This is a really nasty plague, and he really describes it in extreme detail.
This is a sexy plague. Come on.
Yeah. It's nasty sexy. It's basically 10 years of intense intestinal pain, constant throbbing, agonizing pain that lasts for 10 years. At the end of that time, your body starts to decay, and as your body is decaying, the pain sensation switches to an unbearable pleasure. And that's how it kills you. And this is actually the cause of the Starians really reaching out into space, because they realize the ones that are left, there's also a cult of murdering Starians, which is like...
Yeah, so the cult comes up out of
Yeah.
the horribleness of the plague, and they just decide it's better for everybody on the planet to be murdered. So that's basically what happens.
Yeah.
This whole scene and episode of it, I think, was absolutely fantastic. I mean, coming from a cult, horror, video nasty fan, I mean, wow.
It was great.
This is, like, great stuff, and, a trashy Italian filmmaker in the 70s could have knocked off this one bit and had an all-time classic on his hands.
And there was some, like, poetry. Like, the book verges between prose and poetry all the time, right? But there was some poetry specifically pertaining to the plague years, and it was so misanthropic, and so, like, we're all gonna die, find the best way to kill yourself, like, it's really...
We should come up with a giallo name for this one. The plague needs a giallo name for sure. The Plague of 1,000 Pleasures with 2 arms.
That's a good one.
And the silver bow, that has to be in the title somewhere.
Right.
Yeah,
the red lizard.
The silver bow and its unleashing of arrows into the eyes of cats.
Oh, right. It always has to have cats in it. That's right. I forgot.
Something like that. I don't know. We can do better than that. But, so that was really cool.
We need a bottle of J&B for us to do better than that.
Maybe we can find a battery in the garage and zap Mario Bob a couple times and see if he can give us any ideas.
I would so be ready for that one.
No, he would definitely have some ideas, I'm sure. So, and another thing that I liked was... I always liked the books that talk about, space exploration and landing on all these different planets. And of course, we haven't really learned a lot about solar exploration yet in 1854, but the imagination on display is really extraordinary. And of course, he describes a lot of the planets as being capable of supporting life. In fact, every place they land on, including an asteroid at the end, is all habitable except for one, which has an unbreathable atmosphere. So, but
that's what I was actually going to say earlier. Now that I remember it, you're right, John. It did come back to me. The completeness and like the extent to which he was able to extrapolate futuristic things was really interesting, because we just read the other novel that had like a future. We've read like Mary Shelley's futures and all these different futures.
Yeah.
This one had the most science in it, and in science that hadn't even been conceptualized. And I think that was really fascinating for me.
Yeah, and this really comes across in some of the early scenes where he's describing some of the strange biological life on these planets. And
Yeah.
he's doing this for the sheer scientific purpose of it. He's not doing it to exercise a philosophical point. He's not doing it to be funny or witty or something like that. He's simply speculating on exobiology of
Oh,
what
yeah.
plant and animal life could look like on a different planet that has.
And there's some pretty strange stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's really weird stuff. There's like this furry gas bag thing that flies around. There's like all kinds of crazy plant life. On one of the satellites, there's this like race of like snake lizard people or something like that that have trouble breathing atmosphere and being away from their home planet.
Yeah. That's the planet with the flying bladders that suck people's souls. That was a really great horror part, that he describes these flying bladder-like things that attach themselves to people and eat their souls, and they're actually intelligent and sadistic.
Yeah, they prey on life force. And it's just like the luck of the Starian system that these creatures can't escape their home planet for scientific reasons, or else they'd wreak havoc on everybody else.
Absolutely, yeah. That could have been a... You know, what I liked about this, one thing that it's similar in Stapleton's Last and First Men and The Star Maker, is that he'll describe something in a page, and if you just sort of stop reading for a bit and let your imagination kind of wander, you can kind of create whole new stories based on those ideas. So you don't really need, you don't need all this other stuff to latch onto. And I would argue in some ways, Star Psi is not really a novel, because it doesn't really have any characters or anything, and it's all a mishmash of plays and documents and first-hand accounts of travel and poetry and all this stuff.
That's like that framing device that was very modern. That's like what was part of it, because it did use all these different devices that we do see carried on, like tropes and stuff and archetypes of like different types of literary works where these types of things are utilized, far into the future. And like, he really did a great job with it. Like, I loved it.
Yeah, and what it really reminded me of, structure-wise, is Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles.
Yeah,
where it's just kind of a series of vignettes that portray a history of a society.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. And I was also reminded of other things from, 100 years after Charlemagne, like Dune, for instance, with all its intercontextual sections that kind of are part of the world building. Because what Frank Herbert does in Dune is he doesn't stop to describe what things are. He just drops out a whole bunch of names and describes scenes and leaves you to pick up the pieces. But he puts all these things in between the chapters that are like excerpts of songs and poetry and various documents and things like that exist in that future time. And they really help to add a lot to the work. Jack Vance does that a lot too. His books
H.P. Lovecraft does that kind of, because he's very narrative and he's all about his mythos and world building. I mean, any kind of world builder as a writer, this guy totally is a world builder.
Yeah, and you can really feel the culture come alive, especially through the drama. I mean, the dramas aren't going to go up there with Shakespeare or Moliere.
No.
But, I mean, it really gives you a sense of the world. It really gives you a sense of how the people interacted with animals. It gives you a sense of how people interacted with each other, of how the world shapes their thoughts and their feelings. And even small details like that, I just think it's fascinating that he was introducing them so early, and he really seems like an anomaly for this kind of thing, because I can't really think of a single work this early that does this kind of stuff. I mean, we talk about how advanced Mary Shelley is and how odd and out there and forward-thinking Webb is, and even some of the stuff like Bergerac, where they talk about a wide range of technologies and their applications. This really feels like a foreign world that could be lived in.
Yeah.
And it's like a very masterful fantasy piece as well as a science fiction piece because of that. And it was really before its times, and it felt like reading something modern. Well, from like the 50s on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it ties into the idea of believability. when it comes to science fiction and fantasy. So you could write some crazy off-the-wall shit that just makes no sense, and it might not register the same way, whereas if you're writing something and it feels familiar to what you know, but at the same time it's slightly alien, but in a way that is internally consistent and makes sense with itself. So it feels like a world that actually exists. And I think this novel really, really exemplifies that.
Yeah, it does a really good job of that. It does. I mean, there were a couple of sections that dragged a little bit for me. I won't lie, but in
How
general,
can you say that about this one and not about the mummy? My God, man, the mummy dragged.
Hey, I did say that. I did say that the part in Spain was less good than the rest of it.
Oh, this didn't drag compared to the mummy. The mummy was like 300 pages too long.
All right. I think I'll tell you specifically what part dragged for me, because maybe it wouldn't be the same for somebody else. Like I said, I really liked the space exploration part, but I thought he went on for a little bit too long about that guy Sailvelt or something, and his ideas about intellectual slash what was it? I even wrote it down. Being everything is one. I can't find it now. I wrote it down though. It was basically the premise of his intellectual philosophy.
Right, and I think this stuff really speaks to French arrogance.
Yeah.
This is basically a love letter to that. You know, we're the smartest people in the universe, and we're creating this, well, I guess in the book, it's a literal cult of humanism.
Right.
But I think those kind of ideas really start to emerge in France, and you can see them manifest themselves in a real way with the colonialism stuff. I mean, they really go hand in hand, the philosophical arrogance and subjugating an entire race.
Sure.
It's
and they'll always say that they mean well, right? When they subjugate another race,
right,
that other race just doesn't know how to do this stuff, and when we're all together, they know that it's important. You see. But yeah, that whole intellectual supremacy, like, I got the point after a couple of paragraphs. I don't really think he needed to. I don't know. I mean, I get it. It didn't really bog me down, but it was like, okay, all right, I understand. They're basically opting for complete mastery of self and mind and body, and all right, I get it. And it just it went on. It went on. But that was really the only part, and I liked that it really, the unpredictable structure actually worked in its favor, and the fact that he brought in the first-hand account at the end where the Tessulian, which is one of the satellites there, he was the Tessulian guy was traveling to Star in the Aber, which is the ships that they use, and he has a really nice description of coming down over the city and what life is like in the city, and it's coming from an outsider perspective, and I really appreciated that. So it picked up right up again after that whole section.
The city is obviously Paris, in case you were not wondering.
Well, there's no better city that I've been to, so there you go.
Yeah, my experience with it was being trapped in an airport for about 13 hours. So,
I spent a few weeks there, and I will say it's probably one of my favorite places.
Yeah, I'd love to experience it properly. But yeah, the last segment of the historical poem in verse of Elia, where it's this kind of odd, she's an opera theater performer, and then it turns into this weird, like, I don't even know how to describe it, like asteroid love story in the cosmos, like
it's the Star Wars. Yeah. Like, it's a space opera or whatever.
Yeah. So it's another love story. It's very operatic. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's pretty cool.
No, I mean, the imagery is very like, Tangerine Dream, Neptune Towers, It's out kind of type deal. You know what I mean? Like, it's really psychedelic in a way, especially the end scene of them, like, being romantically tangled on this asteroid out in the middle of nowhere,
all by themselves, and it's a perfectly nice. It's a perfectly nice place to live.
Yeah.
So one thing that actually I picked up on that I thought was really cool, one of the other really modernistic things about this book is that they're going to all these satellites, right? And there's quite a lot of Starians left even after the massacre, and they're going to all these satellites which are already inhabited. They don't really, they seem to respect most of the inhabitants, up to a point. I mean, they don't talk about them like the way they do the Replus, but they overpopulate the places where they go, and they cause problems. So eventually, they have to kind of leave. It's pretty much suggested that most of these places that are satellites of star are quite a bit smaller, and they don't necessarily have room to support an entire new society. So it was interesting that he took that angle, because that seems pretty forward thinking as well. Like they visit all these places, and it's like most of them are nice. A couple of the planets are not very nice, like the one with the flying soul stealing guys. But most of them are pretty nice. One of them even has like, you go there and you hang out, and the air actually makes you high. Like, it's the breeze makes you high, man. It's intoxicating. And they're really nice places to visit, but it's like they can't really stay there. It's not practical for one reason or another. Like they even in the first place they land, Tessul, it's probably the least strange, like maybe most star-like, the way they describe it. But even so, he says, "Oh, but it's a little more stunted compared to Star. Everything is smaller, and it's not quite like, the people that are there are very set in their ways, and they're, like they don't. I don't know. They're really just visitors almost, and they keep going outwards, and then at the end, this last scientist traveler who's in love with this opera diva, who also happens to be a great poet and artist, he finally discovers the joy of carnal desires. And the joy of carnal desires help him to be a space explorer. Hey, that's very modern too.
Yeah, and that's how he comes up on Earth.
Yeah.
But even though the Starians don't violently conquer the satellites, they're still very much portrayed as being these benevolent colonizers, the exporters of proper civilization. A lot of the people that live on the satellites that are, I guess, eventually emigrate to Star, the planet, and some degrees of populations are different races, but they are depicted as viewing the Starians as kind of superior race, right? They're people to be envied. So the people, or the person who writes the travelogue, is from Tassel. Right.
Yeah.
So that's one of the satellites, and he's not a Starian, but he's just so awed by Starian culture, Starian civilization, philosophy, and art that he decides to leave his home world for these colonizers. And I think that's a very typical attitude of what the French were doing in this time.
Yeah. So they see the whole thing as being very noble, obviously. That's pretty clear. And there's all these places that are maybe they don't have as much landmass. Maybe there's weird stuff, but they're basically there for the taking. And the people there, they're good to study and they're good to talk to. And yeah, maybe one day they'll come to our great civilization. But by the end, hundreds of years have passed, and yeah, people are basically flying all over the solar system in these bears, which our scientist at the end, Abassur, I think that's his name, he actually revolutionizes this technique that makes them go 10 times faster. Apparently, they're full of electricity, and they are now like super ships. And I guess they can go further out into the cosmos after that, is the suggestion. I really like his little tiny epigraph at the end there, where he, Defontenay's that is, where he basically talks about why he's written this.
Yeah, he breaks the fourth wall.
His note to the reader that says, "Thanks.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed my little romp through the woods."
It's very short and to the point. Like, we didn't mention this in talking about The Mummy, but Jane Webb wrote this pretty long introduction describing why she wrote the book. And it's pretty funny. It's not, it's very skippable. But the Defontenay at the end, he pretty much just wrote a little note saying, "I did my best. I know it's a little weird. I hope you enjoyed it. his final farewell is like he almost says, well, some people think this should come at the beginning. I think it should come at the end. He says, may these stories drawn from another world have made you forget for a moment the miseries of this one. And that's it. And it was really sweet and nice.
Yeah, and that's essentially science fiction and fantasy in a nutshell. You know, it's a form of escapism in some way. And even though it can be commentary on the current world, I think one of the reasons that we're so attracted to these stories is that form of escapism. You know, just getting lost in another world and kind of playing around there and just kind of forgetting the one that we're in for a period of time.
Well, when one is built as nicely as this one was, it was easy to get lost in it.
Oh, absolutely.
So this is definitely a precursor to a lot of things, even if those things are unconscious. I really don't know if Olaf Stapleton had even heard of Defontenay.
So let's talk about that. So this was, I don't know why it was so rare, but the introduction that was at the beginning of the book that we read was from the 1960s, initially written by a French scholar. And he said at the time of writing, there was only something like 5 or 6 copies of the original French pressing in existence. So he republished it in the 1960s, and then it got picked up and translated in English and presumably a couple other languages. I'm not entirely sure about that. In the 1960s, 1970s somewhere. And there was a recent republication from a couple years ago, which uses the same translation. I'm not sure if there's additional critical notes on it. I don't think there are. It didn't seem like there was, but I could be mistaken. But from what I can tell from the introduction is this work was almost completely unknown until the 1960s or so. It was critically panned at the time. This, I guess, somewhat science fiction author later on, he was primarily an astronomer. Was it Flammarion? He heavily panned the book, saying it was total garbage because it was not, like, astronomically correct. You know, he got some of the orbits of the planets wrong or something like that, which is like a really crazy, nitpicky thing to harp on the book for.
But you can see people doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
today.
right, exactly. But from what I can tell, it looks like nobody really has read this book until the 1960s when it was kind of rediscovered. So I don't know if it was the chaos that happened in Europe in the early 20th century that led to libraries and things like that being destroyed, burned, and copies of the books not existing, or if the initial printing was very small and not that many people read it initially. Defontenay died young, so it's not like he had a lot of time to develop a literary reputation, especially considering he was primarily a surgeon. And it looks like he was a plastic surgeon, interestingly enough, given the time.
Apparently he was one of the first to apply these kind of techniques. So I don't know. It's apparently so he died the year after writing this book. So unless somebody was his literary executor or something was there to pick up the pieces, probably nobody was there to make sure that it was reprinted. And if it didn't, it's not like today where everybody has fan communities and stuff like that. I guess it fell into obscurity.
Yeah.
And
Defontenay was primarily a doctor, plastic surgeon, and presumably he would have been focusing most of his efforts on that trade rather than the literary trade. So I'm not exactly sure how much influence any of his literary works had.
Considering that he died the year after, right?
Yeah, but he wrote 4 plays around the same time in 1854. So he had some stuff out there, and he was clearly a literate guy. So I don't know why this was such an obscure work.
I do think that from what I perused of the original French, it does seem to it certainly. I mean, the language maybe has a bit more cadence to it than it does in the English translation. I'm not really 100% confident in French. I would not have read this book in the original French because I'm just not good enough to really feel like I would get it all.
No, I've
But
never done any
did,
French instruction, but I've done,
yeah,
Spanish for 4 years in high school and a year in
right.
college. And even with that, the similarities of the Romance language, I can tell that the translation of the poetry sections in particular of the French into English, like, they don't keep the rhyme scheme necessarily,
No,
and the
you-
words are kind of odd for what they choose. So it does read a bit different in French
yeah.
from the small bit that I did read. I have no formal
I think
instruction in
it
French, so I can just get a sense of
probably.
words, but
I mean, I appreciate the work the translator did, but I think it probably reads a little better in French. I think, but we don't. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, if he had written more stuff, if he had really put more effort into his literary life, then maybe we could say that this was a major influence. But we can't really say that, even though it seems to be the precursor of so much stuff. Not just Olaf Stapleton, but Arthur C. Clarke and many other writers have done things like this that are basically explorations of a culture without.
He was a time traveler. He has the intel. He just didn't tell anyone.
He didn't tell anyone. Yeah.
That's kind of the feeling I got, is that he's actually been there, and he's like, well,
Yeah.
here you go. I
Well,
was from
hey,
the
I mean,
future. I went to go see Star, and I came back, and I'm writing
and it was
about it.
yeah,
It's
and he was
just
very
his
humble
personal
about
journal.
that's how we
Very
learned to do
humble
plastic
about it.
surgery.
Right, exactly. Like, he has, like, I need the air containment tank. I need to, like, everything about it was so modern that it's either that, or maybe the translation really was nothing more than a vehicle for another writer to pick up and use the
Yeah.
work to make his own. Because maybe the translator, actually being in the 1950s or 60s, was like, here's a translation of some cool shit,
Here's
but
a
I can make
translation
it,
of a translation.
but I can make it better.
I don't
So
necessarily
maybe
think it's that, because I did compare the original French with the English translation, and it does match it structurally.
well, good, because that makes me even
Yeah, no,
happier.
Yeah.
for sure. Like the poetry's all there. It's just, I guess it sounds more elegant in French, is what I'll say, with my poor understanding of the language, only by proxy. But yeah, this just feels very ahead of its time, and another example of if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is around to hear it. You know what I mean? And doing this
It's
kind
still
of research, it really brings up a lot of these examples. I mean, we were talking last time about The Last Man and the potential description of Ada Lovelace. Her work on mathematical programming for computers was likewise 100 years before its time, but it just wasn't practical at the time. So it never got adopted. People forgot about it, and it went buried until recent scholarship in the 60s and 70s turned it up again. And I think this is just another one of those examples where, for whatever reason, it fell by the wayside. Because, I mean, it was only 10, 15 years between the publication of this and when Jules Verne's career really took off. And
yeah.
Jules Verne is like the most translated author behind Shakespeare or something like that of all time. So, I mean, you figure
Yeah.
a fellow Frenchman writing kind of in the same genre would draw attention to that just by proxy, but it just really seems like that this influence wasn't felt anywhere else.
Yeah. And of course Verne, Verne is very important and we'll be talking about him at length, but he never really did anything like this. His stories were very firmly pretty much set in the now of his time, just with one little added thing, like a very functioning, fast-moving submarine, or underworld life and dinosaurs and stuff, and he basically did that thing that H.G. Wells did later, where it's like you take the world we know now and you just add one little twist to it that seems weird and different, and there's your basis for a speculative fiction story.
And the basis for
whereas-
steampunk.
well,
This is
that
basically
could
what
be. But Defontenay goes so much further and just basically creates an entire new world. And it's not, I mean, the feelings, what little characterization there is in the plays and stuff, I mean, the feelings are all things you can sort of relate to. But other than that, it's very, it's very alien. But he holds your hand a bit and he takes you on a tour and he shows you all this stuff. The beginning even begins with after he talks about how he found the desk basically of this Starian in the Himalayas and translates it, he starts with an aerial view of star and solar system, and he does it from above, which is, I think, interesting because again, it's very modern. It's very like, imagine you were in a helicopter and you were looking down on these things. This
Yeah,
is what it would be
in a
like.
sense, is a very modern view of the cosmos and how the planets formed in a ring disk formation due to gravity, and it's presented in that fact. You know, the orbits of the various bodies very much resemble the orbits of our own solar system, and
Yeah,
it's clear he was in the astronomical circles at the time because he has a pretty good understanding of how all that functions.
right. You mentioned Flammarion earlier. He was an actual astronomer who wrote a novel. I haven't read it. I can't remember the name of it now, but I read reviews of it, and people were actually faulting it for the opposite reason that he faulted Defontenay, basically saying this guy might know astronomy, but he doesn't know anything about writing a
Yeah,
novel. So,
Hal Clement syndrome.
yeah, yeah, pretty much, I guess. Um, you know, the hard science of the 1850s doesn't necessarily interest in the same way, except in a historical perspective. So you got to be careful with that when you're writing a piece of fiction, right? And I think De Fontenay strikes a really nice balance because yeah, there's a lot of science, but it's tempered with this idea of society and philosophy and a tour of various cultures and ideas.
Definitely a really cool book.
Recommended.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that this was one you should read.
Absolutely.
So does that wrap that up?
I think so.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on The Mummy or Star Psi?
No.
No, I think I pretty much covered most of what I wanted to say about both those books, and it's interesting. There are little things that you can compare to The Last Man and Frankenstein, and earlier on the Moon Journeys and all the other stuff that we covered, and we kind of pointed out some of those. Interestingly, this book and The Mummy both had pretty detailed descriptions of basically a calamity in the air, where all these airships slash spaceships kind of got collided and tangled together, and there was a big disaster. In Star Psi, they managed to avert it more quickly, probably because the Starians always kind of know basically what they're doing, unlike the characters in The Mummy, which are kind of incompetent, which is part of the humor of the
Yeah.
book. But yeah. So why don't we
Yeah, we're
briefly?
done. I was like, I think we're done because we keep things keep getting repeated,
Yeah.
and that's when you're like, well, I think we've covered it all.
Yep. Next time on Chrononauts, we'll be looking at a bunch of short stories. So this time we looked at 2 novels. The next episode we're going to be covering 10 short stories, roughly post-Shelley, pre-Verne. The works we're going to be looking at is E.T.A. Hoffman's Sandman, Honore de Balzac's Gambara, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Rappuccini's Daughter and Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. We'll also be looking at Dmitry Segov's Journey to the Sun and the Planet Mercury and all the visible and invisible worlds, as well as his The Talk of Moscow Citizens about the Comet of 1832. We'll be looking at Semyon Dyuchkov's A Trip to the Moon and a Wonderful Machine with a description of the countries there, customs, and various rarities. We'll be reading Vladimir Fedorovich Odyevsky's Petersburg Letters, Fitzjames O'Brien's The Diamond Lens, and J.D. Welpley's The Atoms of Chladni. We're presenting a Chrononauts exclusives for 3 of the Russian stories, the Segovs and
Yes.
Dyuchkovs. I've translated them for the first time into English, so you can read them with us on our Blogspot page, which is chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. Additionally, you can follow us on Facebook under Chrononauts Podcast, Goodreads, the same, and you can follow us on Twitter at ChrononautsSF. So that's all we have for this time. Tune in next time for some short stories, and we'll see you then.
Good night.